There is a specific point in your financial life where everything changes. Not a number, not a salary, not a net worth milestone. A point. A threshold that, once crossed, makes every financial decision after it feel fundamentally different from every decision before it. And according to the research, only about 1 in 10 Americans ever fully reaches it. Not because it requires an extraordinary income, and not because it demands a perfect financial history, but because most people never get a clear enough picture of what it actually is to aim for it deliberately. Today, we're going to talk about what that point is, why it matters more than any number in your bank account, and what the people who cross it do differently from the people who spend their entire lives just outside its reach. Before we get into it, nothing in this video is financial advice. This is purely for educational purposes and for decisions that affect your financial future. Always speak with a qualified financial professional who knows your specific situation. Now, back to that threshold, because the research on this is both clear and quietly surprising. A 2023 survey from Achieve, a financial services company, asked thousands of Americans whether they were living their personal definition of financial freedom, whatever that definition was, however modestly they defined it. The result, only 11% said yes. Just 1 in 10, living the financial life they themselves described as free. And the most striking part of that finding wasn't the number. It was what people said financial freedom actually meant to them. It wasn't yachts, it wasn't early retirement, it wasn't even becoming rich. The most common definition, chosen by more than half of all respondents across every generation, was simply this: being debt-free. Not wealthy, not retired. Just free of debt. And yet, even that relatively modest definition, being free of the weight of money owed, is something only about 23% of Americans have actually achieved when you count all forms of debt, including mortgages. So what is this point that so few people reach, and why does it change everything when you get there? To understand it properly, it helps to think about financial life not as a single destination, but as a series of thresholds, each one building the foundation for the next. The first threshold is basic stability, having enough coming in each month to cover what goes out without relying on credit or family support to close the gap. This sounds obvious, but according to Federal Reserve data from 2024, roughly 30% of American adults cannot cover 3 months of expenses by any means if they were to lose their primary income. Not from savings, not from borrowing, not from selling assets. An additional group could only cover it by taking on debt or liquidating assets, meaning they have no actual cash cushion at all. Together, these groups represent a substantial portion of American adults living without meaningful financial stability, which means they are perpetually one unexpected event away from a genuine crisis. That is where the financial journey starts for most people, and for a significant portion of the population, it never fully moves past it. The second threshold is resilience, having a cushion that genuinely absorbs shocks without derailing everything else. The standard benchmark here is 3 to 6 months of living expenses in accessible savings. But the Federal Reserve's most recent data shows that only 55% of Americans have even 3 months of emergency savings set aside. That means 45% of adults have no meaningful buffer between their current life and a financial emergency. And this matters more than people realize, because without resilience, every setback is amplified. A car repair becomes a credit card balance. A medical bill becomes a missed mortgage payment. A layoff becomes a cascade of compounding problems that takes years to unwind. Resilience doesn't make you wealthy. It just keeps a bad month from becoming a bad decade. The third threshold is freedom from high-cost debt, the point where you are no longer carrying balances on credit cards or high-interest loans that quietly drain a percentage of everything you earn before it can do anything productive. As of late 2025, Americans collectively owe over $1,277 trillion in credit card debt alone, at average interest rates hovering around 21 to 22%. Someone carrying $10,000 in credit card debt at that rate is paying roughly $2,100 to $2,200 per year just in interest, money that produces nothing, builds nothing, and compounds in the wrong direction. Getting free of that category of debt doesn't just reduce monthly expenses, it fundamentally changes the relationship between income and wealth, because for the first time, money earned can actually stay. The fourth threshold is what financial researchers call having money that works. This is the point where invested assets start generating returns that are meaningful relative to your monthly expenses, where compounding stops being an abstract concept and starts being a felt reality. At $50,000 invested, a reasonable return year adds $3,500. At $200,000, the same return adds $14,000. At $500,000, it adds $35,000, which in many parts of the country is more than some people earn from working. The shift from being entirely dependent on earned income to having a parallel stream of growth income is one of the most psychologically significant transitions in personal finance, and it happens quietly and gradually rather than all at once. And the fifth threshold, the one that only 1 in 10 Americans say they have reached, is the integration of all 4 of the above into a coherent, sustainable system that runs mostly without crisis. Stable income that reliably covers stable expenses. A cushion that absorbs the inevitable surprises without cascading. Freedom from the debt that compounds in the wrong direction. And invested assets that are growing steadily in the background, doing quiet work that doesn't require daily attention. When all 4 of those things are true at once, the experience of financial life changes fundamentally. Not because you're rich, but because you're no longer reactive. You're no longer making financial decisions from a position of pressure. And that shift from reactive to deliberate, from pressured to patient, is what the research consistently identifies as the experience people mean when they say they feel financially free. Here's what makes this framework genuinely useful. Each threshold is reachable on a middle-class income, and each one makes the next one easier to reach. Stability makes resilience possible. Resilience makes paying off high-cost debt possible because you're no longer borrowing to cover emergencies. Freedom from high-cost debt makes consistent investing possible because the money that was going to interest is now available for compounding. And consistent investing, held long enough, eventually produces the kind of returns that make the whole system feel self-sustaining. The reason only 1 in 10 people get there isn't that the path is unavailable to the other 9. It's that the path requires passing through each threshold in sequence, and most people get stuck at one of them, often the first or second, and spend years trying to leap over the stuck point through income alone, rather than addressing the structural issue at that specific level. Someone who earns a significant raise but skips straight to investing without building an emergency fund is one unexpected expense away from liquidating their investments at a loss. Someone who focuses intensely on investing while still carrying 20% credit card debt is earning 7% on one side and losing 20% on the other. A guaranteed losing trade regardless of how disciplined the investing feels. The sequence matters as much as the effort. Now let's talk about what distinguishes the people who move through all 5 thresholds from the people who don't, because the research on this is surprisingly consistent and surprisingly simple. It is not income. Studies consistently show that high earners and low earners fail at roughly proportional rates. People with 6-figure incomes carry credit card debt, lack emergency funds, and arrive at retirement unprepared at rates that track surprisingly closely with the general population once you control for lifestyle spending. It is not intelligence or financial knowledge. Surveys show that financial literacy scores have a meaningful but modest correlation with financial outcomes, and plenty of people with detailed knowledge of investing principles have never built an emergency fund. What actually distinguishes the people who move through all 5 thresholds is something much more behavioral. They treat each threshold as a discrete project with a specific finish line rather than a vague aspiration that competes with everything else in life. The person who says, "I want to be better with money," and the person who says, "I am specifically going to build a $15,000 emergency fund before I make any other financial changes," are not doing the same thing. The second person has a target, a timeline, and a definition of done. The first person has a feeling. And in a world of competing demands on income, feelings lose to specificity almost every time. The other behavioral characteristic the research consistently identifies is what might be called the tolerance for the boring middle, the extended period between starting a financial threshold and completing it, during which progress is real but invisible, and the temptation to redirect resources towards something that feels more immediately rewarding is constant. The people who cross all 5 thresholds are not people who found the journey exciting. They are people who found a way to stay consistent during the long stretches when nothing interesting was happening, when the emergency fund was growing by $200 a month and the debt balance was falling by $300, and the changes were too small to feel like progress. That tolerance for the boring middle, that capacity to stay in a process that is working even when it doesn't feel like it is the single most important financial skill most people never deliberately develop. And it is a skill, which means it can be learned, practiced, and improved. It is not a personality trait that some people have and others don't. Here's where this lands practically. If you are trying to figure out which of the 5 thresholds you are at right now, the honest answer is the one where you feel the most instability, the most reactive pressure, the most sense that a single unexpected event could materially change your situation. That is your current threshold, and that is where your financial energy belongs, not divided across all 5 levels at once, but concentrated at the one level where the foundation is still incomplete. Because every dollar of effort spent at the right threshold compounds through every level above it, and every dollar of effort spent skipping a threshold leaves a gap that eventually pulls everything back down. 90% of Americans have not fully crossed the point where financial life feels like a system rather than a constant negotiation. But the research also shows that the gap between where most people are and where that point begins is not income. It is clarity, sequence, and the quiet willingness to stay consistent through the periods when progress is invisible. Those are things that any income level can provide. The point is reachable. Most people just don't know exactly where it is.